The Income Tax, Root of All Evil by Frank Chodorov. Copyright 1954. Foreword and introduction by J. Bracken Lee, Governor of Utah, I imagine, in the 50s. Foreword. This was, to be sure, the home of the free and the land of the brave. Americans were free simply because the government was too weak to intervene in the private affairs of the people. It did not have the money to do so, and they were brave because a free people is always venturesome. The obligation of freedom is a willingness to stand on your own feet. The early American wanted it that way. He was wary of government, especially one that was out of his reach. He had just rid himself of a far-away and self-sufficient political establishment, and he was not going to tolerate anything like it in this newly founded country. He recognized the need of some sort of government to keep order, to protect him in the exercise of his rights, and to look after his interests in foreign lands. But he wanted it understood that the powers of the government would be clearly defined and limited. It could not go beyond specified limits. It was in recognition of this fear of centralized power that the Founding Fathers put into the Constitution. It never would have been ratified without them. Very specific restraints on federal government. In other matters, the early American was willing to put his faith in home government, in a government of neighbors, in a government that one could keep one's eyes on, and, if necessary, lay one's hands on. For that reason, the United States was founded as a union of separate and autonomous commonwealths. The states could go in for any political experiments the folks might want to try out, even socialism, for that matter, but the federal government had no such leeway, and does not to this day, my addition. After all, there were other states nearby, and if a citizen did not like the way one state government was managing its affairs, he could move across the border. That threat of competition would keep each state from going too far in making changes or in intervening in the lives of the citizens. The Constitution then kept the federal government off balance and weak a weak government is the corollary of a strong people. The 16th Amendment changed all that, in the first place, by enabling the federal government to put its hands into the pockets and pay envelopes of the people. It drew their allegiance away from their local governments. It made them citizens of the United States rather than of their respective states. Theft loyalty followed theft money, which was now taken from them not by their local representatives, over whom they had some control, but by the representatives of the other 47 states. They became subject to the will of the central government, and their state of subjection was emphasized by every increase in the income tax levies. The state governments likewise lost more and more of their autonomy. Not only was their source of revenue being dried up by federal preemption, so that they had less and less for the social services a government should provide, but they were compelled in their extremity to apply to the central authorities for help. In so doing, they necessarily gave up some of their independence. They found it difficult to stand up to the institution from which they had to beg grants and aid. Furthermore, the federal government was in position to demand subservience from the state governments as a condition for subventions. It has now become politically wise for governors, legislators, and congressmen to play ball with the central government. They had been reduced to being procurement officers for the citizens who elect them. The economic power with which the federal government secured by the 16th Amendment enabled it to bribe the state governments as well as the citizens into submission to its will. In that way, the whole spirit of the Union and its Constitution has been liquidated. Income taxation has made of the United States as completely centralized a nation as any that went before it. The very kind of establishment the Founding Fathers abhorred and was set up by the simple change in the tax laws. Wilson. This is no longer the home of the free, and what bravery remains is traceable to a tradition that is fast losing ground. For those of us who still believe that freedom is best, the way is clear. We must concentrate on the correction of the mistake of 1913. The 16th Amendment must be repealed. Nothing less will do. For it is only because it has the enormous revenue that the federal government is able to institute procedures that violate the individual's right to himself and his property. Enforcement agencies must be paid. With the repeal of this amendment, the socialistic measures visited upon us these past 30 years will vanish. 30 years. It's now 2020. The purchase of elections with federal money will no longer be possible, and the power and dignity of the home governments will be restored. This measure should be supported by the governors and legislators of all the states. Every state in the Union now contributes to income taxes to the federal government more than it gets back in grants and aid. This is inevitable because the cost of maintaining the huge federal machinery must come out of the taxes before the citizen can get anything. With the abolition of income taxation, the states will be better able to serve its citizens. And because the state governments are closer and more responsive to the will of the people, there is greater chance that the citizens will get their full dollar's worth in services. However, the principal argument for the repeal of the 16th Amendment is that only in that way can freedom from an interventionist government be restored to the American people. J. Bracken Lee, Governor of Utah. Argument. Tradition has a way of hanging on even after it is, for all practical Tradition has a way of hanging on even after it is, for all practical purposes, dead. We in this country still use individualistic terms, as for instance the rights of man, when, as a matter of fact, we think and behave in the framework of collectivistic doctrine. We support and advocate such practices as farm support prices, social security, government housing, socialized medicine, conscription, and all sorts of ideas that stem from the thesis that man has no rights except those given him by government. Despite this growing tendency to look to political power as the source of material betterment and as the guide to our personal destinies, we still talk of limited government, states' rights, checks and balances, and of the personal virtues of thrift, industry, and initiative. Thanks to our literature, the tradition hangs on even though it has lost force. But there are many Americans to whom the new trend is distasteful, partly because they are traditionalists, partly because they find it personally unpleasant, partly because reason tells that it must lead to complete subjugation of the individual, as in Nazi Germany or communist Russia. And they don't like the prospect. It is for these Americans that this book was written, for their opposition to the trend takes the shape of reform, while nothing will turn it but revolution. And by revolution, I mean the return to the people of that sovereignty which our tradition assumes them to have. I mean to return them the power which government confiscated by way of the 16th Amendment. When you examine any species of government intervention, you find that it is made possible by revenues. A government is as strong as its income. Contrariwise, the independence of the people is in direct proportion to the amount of their wealth they can enjoy. We cannot restore traditional American freedom unless we limit the government's power to tax. No tinkering with this, that, or the other law will stop the trend towards socialism. We must repeal the 16th Amendment. Washington, D.C., Frank Chodorov, February 1954.